So here are a couple of facts which at the time of shooting this video remain basically unconnected. 1. South Carolina Judge Diane Goodstein was involved in blocking the Trump administration from reviewing voter registration data. The sort of ruling that attracts the ire of MAGA and the likes of Stephen Miller, who rail frequently about so-called far-left activist judges committing, quote, judicial insurrection. She wasn't picked out by name by Trump or Miller, but certainly it was reported she had had multiple death threats, something which is now routinely reported as a feature of life as a judge in the United States. Here was a flavour of one social media response to her. Diane Goodstein, may all your evil wishes and evil deeds directed towards Trump and MAGA boomerang back and stick to you and yours 1,000-fold. Now, that specific legal judgment was overruled by the South Carolina Supreme Court 4 days ago. 2 days after that overrule, the beach home of Judge Diane Goodstein burned to the ground after a rapid and very vigorous fire took it. The judge was not on the premises at the time, but members of her family were, and had to jump out of upstairs windows to escape the flames. Her husband was airlifted to hospital with multiple broken bones from the jump. In his 80s, he's of an age where no presumption should be made about what happens next. 3 family members in total were hospitalised as a result of the fire. Now, this led to a few things that were not very surprising at all, and at least one thing that I at least found a bit more surprising. So, unsurprising, a number of people quickly raised the entirely obvious question: was this the latest example of political violence in the United States? It's so obvious a question that the police provided extra security for the judge and her family until such time as the cause can be established. In other words, assuming it may well have been deliberate, because it's so obviously a strong possibility. After all, the rhetoric around judicial actions has been considerably elevated over recent months. And we've recently seen the assassination, of course, of Charlie Kirk, the arson of the home of Josh Shapiro, the would-be assassination of Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh, and the shooting of Melissa and Mark Hauptman, amongst others. So, while at the point of shooting this video, there was no information yet as to the cause of the blaze, as to whether it was deliberate or accidental, it's entirely obvious that people would at least ask the question. And it is a question that matters, because while judges have been enduring a barrage of hate messages and death threats, it would represent one of the first times that had crossed the line into actual action. And that could deliver a massive chilling effect against various judges who might think about their own families and the impact their work would end up having on them. In a state that is on the path towards authoritarianism, such intimidation would very much be one of the tools of the trade, whether by commission or just as a byproduct of rhetoric. So yes, an obvious, valid question to be asked without presupposition as to what the answer to that question might turn out to be. Secondly, another obvious feature, some would be unable to resist immediately jumping to conclusions. So Democrat Senator Daniel Goldman tweeted on a post that showed Goldstein's home burning the following: Trump, Stephen Miller and MAGA World have been doxing and threatening judges who rule against Trump, including Judge Goodstein. Today, someone committed arson on the judge's home, severely injuring her husband and son. Will Trump speak out against the extreme right that did this? That post presumed malicious intent was behind the fire when we had no information to support that. It presumed that should such malicious intent have been involved, it was definitely the extreme right that was involved. Both of those may turn out to be true, but the presumption without evidence, that is part of the phenomenon of a country descending into political violence, where whenever something happens, people are leaping to conclusions, those conclusions always being the ones that most strongly support people's own tribal loyalties over those of the opposition. That remains the case, even if the events now turn in the next couple of days to confirm those presumptions. And the fact that if, in a couple of days' time, the evidence turns out not to support those early conclusions, you're more likely to find people cynically dismissing that evidence because by now they've settled into their belief and they don't want to give it up that easily. Another obvious thing, those that leap to presumptions, and even many who don't, will point to reasons why what just happened shows the other side as being at fault. So right now, both sides are accusing each other of inflammatory rhetoric, with the assumption it can lead to bad actors taking matters into their own hands. This, for example, is what Stephen Miller posted just hours before the house went up in flames. The issue before us now is very simple and clear. There is a large and growing movement of left-wing terrorism in this country. It is well organised and funded, and it is shielded by far-left Democrat judges, prosecutors and attorneys general. The only remedy is to use legitimate state power to dismantle terrorism and terror networks. Miller can point to his statement in that post that such far-left judges can only be combated with legitimate state power. So clearly, he would say, he wasn't encouraging vigilantes. Others will say that demonising judges in itself, in that sort of language, encourages those inclined to take matters into their own hands to see them as a potential target. One more obvious thing. People on the other side will fight back vigorously against any such narrative. So Stephen Miller, finding himself challenged to respond somewhat prematurely to this event, chose to do so in a way that made it very clear his accuser was beneath contempt for even suggesting it. He said this: "You are vile, deeply warped and vile." You have to imagine he was snarling as he types this. While the Trump administration has launched the first ever government-wide effort to combat and prosecute illegal doxing, sinister threats and political violence, you continue to push despicable lies, demented smears, malicious defamation and foment unrest. Now come on, Stephen, tell us how you really feel. Miller's response could have focused on the fact that the cause of the fire was not yet known, could have said that yes, he condemned political violence if that's what it turns out to be, but instead it was just a tribal "how dare you," very much based on the mythology that only the far left is ever involved in political violence, which is the administration's position. And it's one of those fantasies that makes the response to any event such as this totally surreal, as much for the things that people will never ever say as for the things that they do say. So all of that was obvious and predictable for an immediate aftermath of this sort of event. Now, two not obvious things. The first not obvious thing, the controversial, very much tribal MAGA trench fighter Nancy Mace. She was the only politician who posted the bleedingly obvious correct response to this event that had taken place in her own state. Deeply concerned by reports of a fire at a residence in Edisto Beach associated with a South Carolina Circuit Court judge, which left 3 people injured, SLED and local law enforcement are investigating to determine the cause and circumstances. If evidence confirms this was an act of political violence or intimidation, it represents an attack on the rule of law itself, and those responsible must be held fully accountable. Now see, was that really so hard? Stephen Miller, Donald Trump? Really, was that beyond you? And Daniel Goldman, for that matter? If evidence confirms, not presuming, but recognising how it looks, then condemn it as political violence, not caring whose side they were on. You can hate every other single thing Nancy Mace says or stands for. And again, like I've said, she's a lively contributor to the debates, But in this age, where the highest people in the government find such basic political skills beyond them, they should be appreciated and encouraged wherever they are visible. Mace then repeated the sentiments in a subsequent post, which she pinned on her account. The other not obvious part of all this, when I first saw this, it seems so self-evidently a significant event, I had to double check everything because almost no mainstream sources were covering it at all. Time magazine, it turned out, had a piece. Then the Daily Beast reported Stephen Miller as having his meltdown in having it thrown at him, and that was kind of it, save for the Hindustan Times. Even the local South Carolina news sites didn't have anything. So I was wondering, first of all, was it real? But then I saw the Times piece. Then I wondered if had there been some prohibition about talking about it. Over the period since I first saw it and started preparing this video, it's just started to appear. The Wall Street Journal has a piece. Latterly, less than an hour ago, the New York Times caught up. Currently very anodyne pieces, making no reference to that obvious question we've just been discussing. Was this editors trying not to add to potential controversy? Is it a sign of a chilling effect amongst mainstream media outlets based on the Trump administration's actions or potential actions against them? I don't think it can be the latter, because they cover plenty of other stories, but just makes you aware of the possibility that at some point in the foreseeable future, you will end up not hearing about real events, or you do hear about them, but you realise you can't trust the official report of what happened. Already, you would be somewhat wary, let's face it, of taking something that the FBI said about any matter that was politically sensitive. Same for the Department of Justice. For people who told us the limited impact of the bombing of Iranian nuclear sites in the Department of Defense, they were all fired, so them as well. Now, some news outlets will doubtless become more active in sniffing out the reality against that sort of fog. But plenty, and many of the higher profile ones, because those belong to the corporations that need regulator approval for something or another, they will just increasingly tone it down a little, play it a little more safe. And we'll have to work harder to discover what's real, while avoiding the temptation to cynically presume that everything must always be the exact opposite of what's being claimed by the administration, because that also makes you wrong. So we're left with this one observation. The fire at the house of the Goodsteins may or may not reflect America's growing predicament of political violence. That we don't yet know. But the way America has been dealing with the news of it, well, a lot of that does reflect that dilemma. At some point, the downward spiral for all of that becomes so vicious, it actually will become irrelevant what actually turns out to be true and what turns out to be false, because everyone will just believe what they want to believe. That is a downward slide everyone should be keen to resist, if at all possible.